Likutei Sichos Chelik Yud Ches, Volume 18, the second Sicha for Parshas Matos. As an introduction, we all know that in order for one to be able to use a pot, a pan, or any whatsoever kli, any whatsoever dish that one uses for a meal that comes in direct contact with the food, one needs to first, when you buy it from a goy, from a non-Jew, even if it was perfectly clean, even if it was never used, one needs to immerse it in the mikveh. Of course, if it was once used before, then you need to also kasher it. You need to do hag'ala, which is either in boiling water, or if it's something that was used in more intense heat, like an oven or something, then you have to actually burn it, until you can burn out the non-kosher substance that's there. Now, in this Sicha, we're actually going to learn to appreciate the essence, the idea of this halacha for why one needs to immerse kalim, even new kalim, in a mikveh prior to being able to use it. I would suggest to review the pasuk in our parsha, which speaks about this exact mitzvah, the mitzvah of these two mitzvahs actually, the mitzvah of the obligation, that is, of kashering kalim if they came in contact with non-kosher food, if they were used for non-kosher food, either in cooking or warm or hot, and the obligation to immerse them in a mikveh prior to their usage. So I would suggest that you review Pasuk Chav Gimel, that's verse 23, in chapter 31 in this week's Parsha. I just go through it quickly over there. After it says, quote, everything that came in fire, meaning that was used in fire, you should pass through fire. That means you have to cleanse it by passing through the fire. However, it has to be immersed in a mikvah in order to become purified. But anything that hasn't gone through fire, meaning it hasn't been used as a cooking utensil, you should still pass it through water. That's almost verbatim the words of the pasuk. So this sicha actually begins with a question in the Ramban. The Ramban, Nachmanides that is, who explains the Rashi on this pasuk, and he asks a very interesting question. And I would say it's not mamish, it's not exactly a Rashi sicha per se. However, we will get a better understanding and appreciation of Rashi, and also come to learn yet another rule in Rashi's style, in Rashi's approach to explaining the pasuk. So let's go into it. In our parsha, after the war with Midian, if you remember, this was a war of revenge for what Midian had caused to the Jewish people, and they come back to Moshe with all the spoils of war. So Moshe commands them that, hey, everything that you're going to bring home to your homes now to use for your own meals or for preparation of meals, you should know that if they were ever used, they went to put, quote, on the fire, then you need to do hag'ala. Hag'ala is, again, you have to cleanse it, you have to kasher it by the same means that it was used, either in boiling water or in direct fire and so on. And then he tells him that all utensils that are used for a meal, even the ones that you don't use for cooking, you need to immerse them in water. Now the Ramban asks a very interesting question in discussing this Rashi. And he says, one second, why is this matter being brought up now, here, after the war of Midian? We know, if you look several parshias ago, we had another war, actually two wars. We had the war with Sichos and the war with Og, and we conquered their lands and took all the spoils of war and divided them up amongst the people. So why over there were they not commanded to cleanse these utensils that they brought home, and obviously they're going to use it, they weren't just going to throw them away? Why over there didn't the Torah tell them anything, and only here does it make a big deal out of it? So the Ramban explains that because the territory of Sichos and Og is actually considered part of Eretz Yisrael. It became incorporated in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, there was no issue of kashrus. You see, the Gemara in Chulin, in Tractate Chulin, the Gemara discusses over there, and it tells us that for the 7 years that it took them to conquer Eretz Yisrael, and this is actually implied from the pasuk. You can look it up on page 17. For the 7 years that they were busy conquering Eretz Yisrael, they were allowed to eat even, quote, cuts of pigs. Literally, they were allowed to eat treifas, whatever they found there, they were allowed to eat. They did not have to bother or busy themselves with looking for kosher food or securing kosher food. Whatever they came to their way, they were able to eat. And therefore, if eating the food itself, non-kosher, was a non-issue, then certainly the kalim, the utensils that are used for it, is certainly a non-issue. And therefore, there was no problem, says the Ramban. But over here, when it comes to this war, the war with Midian, this was not a matter of conquering their land. In fact, they didn't conquer the land. They didn't take their land. It never became incorporated into Eretz Yisrael. Rather, this was just a means of revenge that Hashem gave a special instruction to annihilate the Midyanim, the people from Midian, those who caused them so much harm. And then they took the spoils, they took the loot. So therefore, over here it became an issue, because this exemption of not having to keep kosher throughout the time that they're conquering Israel did not apply to this. Okay, that's what the Ramban explains. However, the commentaries on the Ramban ask the following question. True that there was no issue with kashrus, with having to eat kosher and having to secure kosher utensils, because they were allowed to eat non-kosher. But the question they ask is, it would seem that they still would have had to immerse those kalim, because we know that as we said in the introduction, the idea of immersing utensils that one uses for a meal, that one uses in the process of cooking or in serving for a meal, has nothing to do with isur. It has nothing to do with the kli, with the utensil being kosher or not. It has nothing to do with that, because the fact is that even if you buy a brand new pot or a brand new dish from a guy that would never been used, there's no isur there, you still need to immerse it in mikvah. And you can't answer, well, they were allowed to have non-kosher food, because this is a separate matter. So the question is, the Ramban doesn't even seem to address it. He doesn't say anything. He explains this Rashi, asks the question, gives the answer, and doesn't even bother addressing this point. Why wouldn't he have gone into it? In other words, it's curious. What is the answer? Why not? Says the Rebbe, in order to understand this better, we'll first introduce actually two more curious things in relation to this idea, to this mitzvah, to this halacha, that is, of immersing utensils. The first one has to do with the sale of chametz. It has to do with Pesach. We know that we sell the chametz. Why do we sell the chametz? Because you're not allowed to be in possession of chametz. So you sell it to a guy, and this sale is not hocus pocus. This sale is real. It's 100%. It belongs to the guy. And therefore, some two great halachic authorities, namely the Noida B'Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer, they suggest that a person should not sell their pots and pans and utensils to the guy, should not include it in the sale of chametz. Why? Because if you do, then it belonged to the guy. And if it belonged to the guy, when it comes back to your possession, they argue, you would have to actually start immersing. Imagine what the mikvahs would look like after Pesach, when thousands of Jews would be bringing thousands and thousands of utensils, truckloads, in order to start, again, immersing them in mikvah. Now, that's what they suggest. However, the Alter Rebbe, in his famous Shtar Mechiras Chametz, the famous document, the sale of Chametz document, which the Alter Rebbe prepared, which covers every single issue, the entire gamut, every single detail, every single problem that could or could not come up. And it's like the most perfect sale of Chametz. And in fact, today it's widespread, it's used by everyone. The Alter Rebbe says, very matter-of-factly, that included in that, in other words, in the list of the things that you're selling to the guy, is also any utensil that has chametz on it. And he doesn't mention a word. There's absolutely no discussion at all about this issue of having to immerse it. So it's quite clear from the fact that the Alter Rebbe suggests, or not only suggests, he tells you that you're selling your kalim, you're selling your utensils, and then yet he doesn't say anything about having to immerse them in a mikveh later, having to do tefillas kalim. So it's obvious that according to Alter Rebbe, this is a non-issue. And the question is why? They have a good point in Noida B'Yehuda and Chassam Sofer, or so it seems. it did pass over to the possession, to the ownership of the goy. So now when it comes back to your ownership, like any time you buy from a goy, why do you not need to immerse it in the mikvah? That's one thing that we're going to, by understanding this, we'll get an answer to the question on the Rambam. So we have now really two questions already. The first one is about the Ramban, and the second one was about the sale of chametz and why you don't have to re-immerse those kelim. Now a third thing. We all know that on Shavuos, the anniversary when we receive the Torah, the custom is to eat the dairy meal. Contrary to what we do on every festival, that we eat only a festive meal which consists of meat. Why do we do it? This is to commemorate the fact that on the day that the Jews received Torah, they became Jewish, and they were now obligated to eat only kosher. In other words, they became aware that they have to, and also obligated to keep kosher, but they could not slaughter any animals on that day. Why? Because even though you're allowed to slaughter animals on Yom Tov, well, we all know, and everybody agrees, that the day that we received the Torah, the day of the week was Shabbos. So there was no possible way for them to produce kosher meat on that day. And obviously any meat they had prior to that, they were not going to eat, because now they're obligated to keep kosher. So therefore they ate dairy products, because, in those days there was no issue of chalav. So it was all good. Any milk products, any cheeses, any dairy products they had up to that point was fine, was 100% kosher. Milk is milk, cheese is cheese. And therefore, that's what they ate, and that's why we commemorate it. But the question is, 1 minute, we can ask a question. They just became Jewish. By receiving the Torah, it was like a conversion, so to speak. And that's where actually we learned the laws of conversion. So they became Jewish. So yesterday they weren't Jewish. So the kelim that they owned, meaning even those dairy utensils that they were now using, how could they possibly use it? Because yesterday, or prior to Matan Torah, it belonged to, quote, a non-Jew, and now it belongs to them as a Jew. And we don't find that they should be obligated to immerse it in the mikveh. Now, you could try perhaps to answer, the attempt to answer this would be that, look, when they left Mitzrayim, when they left Egypt, they left with the purpose, the intention of receiving the Torah. In other words, they knew they were receiving the Torah. We know that they counted the Omer. We know that they were gearing up for this. They were preparing themselves mentally, spiritually to receive the Torah. And therefore it follows, and it seems obvious, that they also started to implement the general ideas of kashrus. And one of them being, of course, the primary one, not to mix milk and meat. And therefore, there was no issue of those dairy utensils being non-kosher, because it's clear that they separated it, so you had meat and milk separate. The meat wasn't kosher, so now they will have to kosher those kelim, because they didn't have the ability to shecht and produce kosher meat. But milk is milk, dairy is dairy. So for that, it wasn't an issue, it wasn't a matter as far as it being kosher. But the Rebbe asks, as far as it being toiveled, as far as it having to be immersed, that's the question. Why did they not have to immerse it? In other words, how were they able to use their dairy utensils without first immersing it in a mikveh? Because it's like as if you came from a guy. So the Rebbe says, as discussed many times, although Rashi is pshutay shel mikra, he's exclusively the pshat, the basic elementary understanding of the pasuk, yet in the style, in the language, the choice of words that Rashi uses, you can find some profound insight, halachic insight, and other insights, even sometimes the deeper secrets of the Torah in the words of Rashi. So if we looked, and especially when Rashi explains something, and then he says, the Rabbi Seinu Darshu, and our rabbis darshan, they derived, then this is not only adding or emphasizing something in Pshutei Shel Mikra, in the pshat of the pasuk, in the simple basic meaning of the pasuk, of the verse, but there also is hidden a treasure of insight in halacha. So if we look in the Rashi here, on that verse that I suggested to you in the introduction, Rashi explains what this is about, the immersing it. So Rashi says, Lefi Pshuta, according to the basic meaning, the chitui zeh, this purification, is to purify it from tumas meis, from the impurity of coming in contact with that body, because a lot of these people were killed in order to take their spoils. Moshe said to them, says Rashi, these utensils need gi'ul. They need to be koshered, litaharom. Please notice the word, litaharom, to purify them from isur, from the prohibition. In other words, to make them clean, to cleanse them, to purify them from any isur that they may have in them. And then you need to purify it you need to put it for further purification in the mikvah in order to take it out of the tuma, of the impurity, the ritual impurity that they may be in. Then Rashi continues and he says, V'rabbeinu darshu, and our rabbis derived, they explained, that from here we see, quote, Sha'af lahachshiran min ha'isur, that also to make them kosher from the isur, to prep them from the isur, one also is required to do tefillah. Now the Rashi, in this Rashi it comes out that the idea of immersing it, the tefillah, that you have to immerse these utensils, has to do with the isur, with some prohibition. In other words, it has to do with the fact that there's some treifus in there. But the question is, it doesn't make sense. What is Rashi really saying? Because we all know, and this is the actual fact of the halacha, that even new utensils that have never been used, that are visibly and obviously new, and have no issue of having isur in them. There is no isur in them; it was never used. Yet they must be toivel. They must be immersed in the mikvah. So the question is, what exactly is Rashi saying? What is he doing by associating this immersing in the mikvah with having isur in it? There is no isur there, or it's not inherently the reason for having to immerse kalim in the mikvah. So the Rebbe says, in order to understand it, let's take a closer look at the choice of the expression, the exact expressions that Rashi uses. When it comes to extracting the actual isur, the actual treifus from the pots, Rashi uses the expression letaharom. Letaharom means to purify them, to cleanse them. But when it comes to the immersion in the mikvah of the kelim, Rashi uses the expression lahachshiram, to, what is the word lahachshiram? What is the word kosher? To make him kosher. What does it mean to make him kosher? So the Rebbe says tahara, purification, applies to something which is either impure or is forbidden. And you make it pure, you make it clean, you cleanse it. The word lahachshir comes from the word fit. Kosher means fit. That it's like prepping something and making it ready, making it fit for use. In other words, the accomplishment of immersing something in mikvah is not to take out some kind of entity, some foreign entity, something that is forbidden. But it's only to take that vessel and, so to speak, transfer it from the category of susceptibility to isur, which means that when it was by a goy, even though it wasn't actually used, it was in the box, it was in the store, but potentially, at least, the fact that it belonged to the goy, in other words, it was in his domain, it belonged to him, that means that that vessel, at least potentially, could have been, or maybe even would have been used, had it not been sold to you, for isur, and it would have become absorbed with forbidden foods, forbidden non-kosher foods. However, when it goes into the ownership, it goes in now to the domain of a Jew, now it needs to be purified, because now it's going out of that category of susceptibility to isur, and it's going into the ownership of a Jew, where it has now no susceptibility to isur. It is not going to be used for something that's forbidden. And now, in other words, the Rabbi emphasized, I just want to reiterate, emphasized and focused in on the word lahachshiram that Rashi uses. It's not to make it kosher. It's not to take it out of isur, literally taking out of isur, because then you would use the term letaharam. Letaharam means to cleanse, to purify. But lahachshiram means to prep it, to make it fit, to make it useful. That's what it means. And that's what Rashi is saying. The achshiram, it's not literally to take away the isur, because there is no isur, especially in a brand new kli. But it's to make it fit for one who has no connection to isur, from having been in the status of or so to speak, in the domain, the general domain of susceptibility to Isser. And now we can answer the three questions. The reason why the Ramban doesn't address it is very simple, because the Ramban doesn't have to add the idea of immersing, because since according to Rashi it is associated with Isser, not actual Isser, not actual Trefus, but it's associated with Trefus. In other words, that's the inherent reason why we have to toivel. So it follows that if they're allowed to eat the actual Trefus, and they don't have to kosher the kelim, they don't have to put it through fire or through hot water, then obviously they don't have to put it in the mikveh. So it was no issue. There's no point. There's no need for the Ramban to further explain it when he already had told us. He made the point that they were allowed categorically to consume any isur. So there was no reason for him to go further in this issue, because he's explaining the Rashi, and according to Rashi, the way we just explained, Rashi's premise is that the idea of immersing kelim is because it has the association to Isser. That's it. So the matter falls away. When it comes to Mechiras Chametz, the selling of the Chametz, so the Rebbe says, even though we know that this is an absolute sale, this is not a hocus pocus, this is literally a sale, and it literally belongs to the guy. Furthermore, there are many who actually even have the custom of giving the guy a key to the place so they have direct and full access, open access to the chametz and to the utensils that were sold to them in chametz. But still, practically speaking, says the Rebbe, it never happens, and there's not even a potential of it happening, that the guy should actually come and touch the kelim and use the kelim. In other words, the whole idea that Rashi said was that it has a susceptibility to Isser. There's no susceptibility even here to Isser when the guy would never practically come to your home to go and use your frying pan or to go and use your soup pot or whatever, or what have you. And then when it comes to the issue of Shavuos, with eating only dairy, and how they're able to use those utensils, so again, we have the answer right there. Because if you remember, the Rebbe made the point that it's certain, it's obvious, that even though they didn't have to keep kosher yet, and they couldn't keep kosher yet because they didn't have the means of shechting and it being effectively changing the meat from non-kosher to kosher, but still they did behave in a kosher manner. What does that mean? They separated milk and meat. Since they separated milk and meat, so their dairy utensils never were even susceptible for Isser. So therefore they never needed to be toiveled in the first place. Why? Because again, Rashi's point is that the reason why you toivel it is not because it has actual Isser, but even for the cause of the fact that since it belonged to a goy, and it was in the usage of the goy, or at least it belonged to him, it was in the domain of a goy, therefore it was susceptible to Isser. This was never susceptible to Isser, to any prohibition, and therefore it didn't need to be toiveled.